Millions of despairing men, women, and little children, victims of a system that makes men torture and imprison innocent people.
You cannot shake hands with a clenched fist.
Produced by a nuclear exchange would be carried by wind and water and soil and seed to the far corners of
the kingdom of God, the kingdom of heaven.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
We're not saying that planet Earth is coming to an end. We're saying that planet Earth is about to be refurbished, spaded under, and have another chance to serve as a garden for another civilization.
Most of the people in here are just your reflections. They're your mistakes.
1776 will commence again if you try to take our firearms.
1 million of the planet's 8 million species are threatened.
You are what you repeatedly do. Therefore, excellence ought to be a habit, not an act.
Your lives and the credibility of the United Nations is at stake.
Epstein didn't kill himself.
The reason this is such an interesting time is not only because we're on the threshold of the end of this civilization.
They're trying to take you out with bullshit.
The experience of the past 2 years has proven beyond doubt that no nation can appease the Nazis.
To those who can hear me, I say, do not despair. The misery that is now upon us is but the passing of greed, the bitterness of men who fear the way of human progress. The hate of men will pass, and dictators die, and the power they took from the people will return to the people. And so long as men die, liberty will never perish.
In the language of the U.S. Department of Defense, these are unidentified aerial phenomena.
Roswell's a very interesting place with a lot of people that would like to know what's going on.
There is very compelling evidence that we may not be alone.
This is the Garden of Doom.
Welcome everyone into Garden of Doom. We're welcoming in one of our old friends, Darius Kamali. He was on before. He is, among other things, and he'll tell you more about himself, the host of the Persian Version. He also is the administrator and founder of a terrific website, Facebook group as well. Darius, how are you today?
Doing well. Who are you calling old?
Well, in terms of my podcast existence.
That could be in podcast years, yeah.
Yeah, they're like dog years. You know how it is.
They're like dog years. Right.
You know how it is. I mean, you did your 11 podcasts, and now all of a sudden it's like, oh boy.
I know. Hey, listen, I'm going to jump back into it this month. So
I hope so. Your podcast is terrific, and there's both some long versions and there's some short version ones, and it's so folks out there, if you want to binge all of the Persian versions, and one of them is a simulcast with the Garden of Doom. You could probably catch up in one afternoon, but certainly in 2 days. So anyway, Darius, please tell them a little bit about yourself. You're not just a podcaster. There's a lot of dimensions to you, including some that involve Tinseltown.
Yeah, a little bit fifth dimension sort of guy. My background, it includes, I had a stint, I guess you could say, as an analyst for a State Department supported NGO or non-governmental organization, which was actually government supported. So there's your irony right there. But it served as the visual evidence wing for several war crimes tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and for Rwanda and also for Iraq, the Ba'athist regime and Saddam Hussein. Then I transitioned into being everything from researcher to writer to producer, segment producer, series producer for a number of History Channel shows, other shows as well, but most of them ended up on History Channel as the distributor. And then after that, I sort of fell into something entirely different, at least on the surface, which was feature animation. Did a film called Igor in 2008 and have done one or two others since then for Netflix and Amazon Prime, and a little bit of augmented reality. So I'm wearing a lot of hats, and on this topic that we are talking about today, I have to say again that I mentioned this last time, but I want to make sure that I let everyone know I don't consider myself to be an expert in this field. My knowledge in the field is mostly journalistic, I would say. as an enthusiastic amateur, hopefully in the best sense of that word, which I think has something to do with someone who has passion. So I'll take that. And what I have learned over the last, I guess, couple of years, mostly since the beginning of the pandemic, I have to say, when I had some time on my hands, regarding this topic, has been very eye-opening, you could say, maybe even astounding to me. And those who've been on the journey with me on the Ariana and the Persian version group and podcasts, that I've decided to actually develop. I mentioned this to you yesterday offline, Jeff, both a book project and a documentary on this subject. And so I'm sort of officially announcing that now.
That's very exciting. Those are great projects. And mention the name of the Facebook group again, so folks, if they want to take a look for it, they can peruse it, join it.
Absolutely. On Facebook, there's a group called Ariana, Aryana, and it's the history, art, and culture of the Iranic and Iranian and Persian and Persianate peoples. They just put those terms in, it'll come up. And the podcast, which you're aware of, is simply the Persian version, which, if you remember this from last time, it's actually, I thought I had invented the word, and I thought it was very clever and it was very cute, but it turns out there's a poem by that name, by Robert Graves. But that doesn't, it's, he's long dead.
Long dead, and listen, copyrights have to do with the entire context of the work, not the name itself.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm kidding about that, but I'm actually happy because I actually I read the poem as the first episode of the podcast. So
and it rhymes. And by the way, folks, if you want to catch up on the last podcast where Darius talked about a lot of stuff. I mean, from the origins of the Iranic peoples to the difference between Persian and Iran mythology. We talked about Zoroastrianism. We talked a little bit about Mithras. You name it. The podcast, the title is simply the Persian version. So it's the same show on the Persian version entitled, I think it's called the Persian version on the Garden of Doom. Or if you look on the Garden of Doom, the show is entitled The Persian Version, because I am that clever. Now, I'm going to have to come up with a new name for this one, but that's okay. So today, Darius wants to expand a little bit more on a little bit where he left off. He wanted to clarify a couple things. He also wanted to talk about sort of the migrations of Iranic peoples beyond what we think of as, near Asia, from far Asia to what we call, by the way, the term near Asia is so doofy. Near to what?
Somebody should mention that. By the way, you can hear me fine, right, Jeff?
What's that?
You can hear me fine, yes?
I hear you perfect, yep.
Okay, great. Yeah, in fact, I'm glad that you brought that up. That's sort of a pet peeve of a lot of us, not just from my ethnicity, but from anywhere in Asia. The concept of near east and far east. Well, near and far from whom?
Exactly.
Eurocentric, right? Clearly, it's a European term. And so, I think the better term, and I'm not one of these people who insists on, gets mad if people use the wrong name for anything. But if we're going to be correct about it, we should probably say Western Asia and Eastern Asia, as opposed to near and far, because that implies near and far from whom,
Exactly. Well, you're in California, so China and Japan is your Near East. So.
Yeah. So I just use in fact, people don't even sort of always make the connection that what we call the Near East or the Middle East is actually Asia. Right.
As a matter of fact, I just misspoke. It's not your Near East. It's your Near West. It's your Near Asia. Your Near East is Utah. So.
Depends which way you're facing, right?
Right. So, all right. So let's forget. Yes, I agree with you. I think the terminology is extremely outdated. And yes, it's obviously from a European standpoint. It's not even from a American European standpoint, because it doesn't make any sense in the context of America either, or at least maybe the Eastern time zone, but maybe the Central. I'm not sure. Anyway, not particularly important today. Something we'll work on in the future, I suppose, you and I. But why don't you pick up? I know that you want to clarify one term which is rightfully a pet peeve of yours, and it should be. And then I know you want to trace sort of the migrations of various Iranic peoples into Europe, and then we were going to talk about some stuff that it's your story. You tell it.
Sure. Yeah, no, I think you're talking about the word Aryan. Yeah, so do that first, or I was going to leave it till last, but we might as well get out of the way.
Yeah, let's do it.
Absolutely. See, that's a term that's used differently in different places, or it's not used differently, but it has different connotations these days.
Sure.
Because of its association with Nazi ideology, right? So let's be clear right up front that nobody here is a Nazi. We all disavow the Nazi ideology. Aryan is simply a designation for a group of people. Now, how broadly it's defined and how tightly and how specifically, it depends on the era and who you ask. It originally was used for all of the Indo-European ethno-linguistic family. And that's a very large linguistic family. That includes almost all of the European languages, as well as some non-European languages like Persian, like Sanskrit in India, so on and so forth. And in fact, the discovery of this family, if I could tell you, a couple of things about that, occurred in the 19th century, really, when the British were ruling India. Some of the scholars there were astounded to find how much of the vocabulary of some of the Indian languages, particularly Sanskrit, was similar to or identical with many of the European languages. And they just couldn't explain why this was, because they're so geographically separated and far from each other. And that began the whole field of Indo-European studies, which includes many sorts of disciplines within it: linguistics, philology, today even archaeogenetics, archaeology, history, so on and so forth. And the discovery was made that, in fact, all of these languages had a common ancestor, which we now theoretically call Proto-Indo-European, PIE for short, PIE, right? And that probably those people that we call the Proto-Indo-Europeans, the PIE people, the ancestors of all these languages, including most of the European languages, plus Persian, Sanskrit, Armenian, and a couple of others, originated somewhere north of the Black Sea, the Pontic Steppe, they call it. Basically, today's where the conflict is happening in Ukraine with Russia. There are alternate theories. Some say it was actually Anatolia. Some say it was closer to Azerbaijan, maybe northern Iran. But by and large, sort of between the Caspian and Black Seas is where the vast majority of people, even Colin Renfro, who was kind of a bit of a singular character in the field, believe that that's where the parent originated. Now, that we're talking about 3,000 or so BC, right? And even earlier than that. So 5,000 years before the present.
Right.
Since that time, this group, this PIE group, this Indo-European, or something they used to call it the Aryan group, separated into various parts. Some of them became the Germanic peoples, went westward into Europe. Some of them became the Celtic people. Some of them became the Italic people, which includes Latin, right? The Greeks. And a few of them went eastward, like the Indo-Iranians. The Indo-Aryans were today's Iranians, the Armenians, the Tokharians, and the Indo-Aryans who went into northern India and created Sanskrit and contributed to the Vedic religions of India. So we're talking about a vast geographic range, started somewhere, we think, in what is now Ukraine. Of course, there was no Ukraine then.
Right.
Most of these people migrated westward and created most of the European peoples, and some of them went eastward and created the Indo-Iranian peoples. Since World War II, since not only Hitler, but even before that, some of the 19th century scientific racists like Gobineau, Frenchmen, and some Germans, took this theory and postulated that everything good in the world that has been created by these people. And by the way, Germans are the purest remaining version of these people.
Naturally.
Yeah, obviously, right? And, there's been many volumes written on this topic, so on and so forth. And so after World War II, because the word Aryan had gotten a negative connotation due to its association with this very specific and very temporal German ideology, so it no longer was really just a group of an ethnicity or language group, but it had a connotation of superiority, right? So linguists have stopped using that term for the whole group. They only use it now for the Indo-Iranian group, the group that went eastward. So if you look in any reference or any book, those people are still called Aryans. But the broader group is called Indo-European. Now, I don't mind which group is, but which word is used, but I want to make sure that people understand that if you go to Iran or Afghanistan or Tajikistan or India, they regularly use the word Aryan. And, they, I think, very understandably say, look, we had nothing to do with German ideology of superiority. This is just our name. It's like telling someone to stop using the name for their ethnicity that they've used for thousands of years. And so that's where we are. I also want to add that, I think the best way to distinguish between the Nazi ideology and those who are just simply using it as an ethno-linguistic designation is not to try to deny that such a group exists. Some people have gone that direction and said, well, there never was any such group. There is no Pi. I think that's bogus. There's mountains of evidence that there was such a group. There's libraries filled with evidence today, even genetic evidence, that there was such an ethno-linguistic group. We don't have to deny the existence of an ethno-linguistic historical group. All we have to do is deny the Nazi ideology that was attached to it in the 19th century. Does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense. I think it's easier said than done, but it makes a lot of sense. And I think that the first thing is getting the information out there, because I think a lot of people, especially in my part of the world, the United States, and probably other parts of Europe, and probably the other continents as well that aren't maybe as focused on it, just don't know that. So thank you for clearing that up. There's nothing I can do to expand or perfect upon it. So that was great.
Thank you.
Yeah. So from there, I'm sorry I sort of messed up your order, but you can pick it up from wherever you intended to start and give the introduction as you like, because I know that this show is going to be partly historic, and then there's going to be some things that are historic, but also, maybe a little bit more fanciful, maybe a little bit more fun, but still historic in nature. And you're going to weave them together as the storyteller that you are.
I'll do my best. Yeah. So let me pull this up here. Yeah. So I think when we're talking about the topic of the show today, which is the migration of various Iranic peoples into Europe, we have to clarify a couple of things. One of them has to do with the story that I just told about the discovery of Indo-European. We are not just talking about, or I'm not just talking about that original common ancestor, that Proto-Indo-European here. That's pretty well established. A lot of people, even lay people, are well aware of the Indo-European language family. So when we're talking about Iranic migrations, it's not some broad, generic, we're talking about the Proto-Indo-Europeans. No. That was 3,000-4,000 years BC. What I'm going to be talking about today is much, much later. Long after these groups had separated from each other and had become distinct groups already. So if you're talking about early Indo-European history, it doesn't make sense to call any of it Iranic or Germanic. It was just one group, right? However, by the time you get to the historical era, from 1000 BC onward, now these groups have definitely separated from each other and have become distinct Germanics, Italics, Celtics, Slavic, Indo-Iranians, and they have geographically separated from each other and culturally, to some degree, separated from each other. After that, the Indo-Iranian group, some of them anyway, the groups that I'll be talking about today, actually migrated westward again into Europe, where some of the other their brothers from the past had already migrated, like the Germans and the Italians. They'd been there quite a while. So the claim here is again, to be clear, not simply that all these groups had a common origin. That's well known. The claim that's less well known is that after they had separated, the Ironics went into Europe again. And specifically, when I'm talking about the Ironics, let me define that term. People aren't used to hearing the word Ironic as opposed to, let's say, Iranian.
Sure.
So Iranian is now used just for the people of the country, the nation state of Iran. And Iranic are people who are ethno-linguistically Iranian but don't live in that country. And a lot of people don't even know that there is such a group, but there is today. And historically, there has been many groups that are now sort of baked into other populations, including European populations. So it's very similar to, I'll give you an example that people are more familiar with, maybe German versus Germanic, right? So the English English language is a Germanic language,
yep,
but it's not Germany, right?
Right.
So in the same way, today the Tajiks of Afghanistan or Tajikistan are Iranic, but they're not part of Iran.
Correct.
And historically, there have been many Iranic peoples, some of whom no longer exist. They were, like I said, baked into other populations like the Slavs and the Germans and so on and so forth. And a few of them do exist, and we'll get to them at the end. They're still around, and they're still distinct, and they still call themselves. Well, we'll get to that later. So, specifically, who are these Iranic groups that migrated back into Europe all the way? And we're not just talking about the Balkans or Eastern Europe, by the way, or even Central Europe, but as far as Western Europe, as far as Gaul, which is France, and a few of them even to Britain, Scotland and Ireland, in fact.
Wow.
Yeah, absolutely. So these groups include the Scythians, sometimes called the Saka. We talked about them in the previous interview. The Sarmatians, also the Alans or Alans, the Rox Alans, a subcategory. Another group is the Yazigis. If you're worried about pronunciation, don't worry, because any pronunciation we have today is going to be vastly different than probably how they refer to themselves, so let's not even try.
Right.
The Aorsi, the Jazz, J-A-S-Z, and similar ethno-linguistically and culturally Iranian or Aryan, quote-unquote, tribes. So my contention is seldom has the influence of a culture on another been so vast, multifaceted, and well documented within the halls of specialist academia, while at the same time being so utterly unknown among the general public. I would submit for largely political reasons these days. So when did this happen? By the way, Jeff, if you're unclear about anything or anything pops into your head, cut me off at any moment.
Oh, I sure will. That's why the camera's here, so you can see me raise my hand or whatever. But I haven't yet, because you're doing a great job, and I will. If I feel like I have anything to add or if I have a question, but no, I think you are
deeply versed in this stuff over the last couple of years, and I forget that it's a lot of it is new information. And I need to be very clear. So when did this happen? Some of your listeners may have heard of the great migrations that happened during the decline and fall of the Western Roman Empire. Mm-hmm. The so-called barbarian invasions from the north that came in and finally put an end to Western Rome. Obviously, it wasn't the end of Rome entirely, because Rome became Byzantium and went on in another form. But Western Rome itself, fell. And most people, I think, would associate those barbaric invasions, migrations, a combination of two from the north, as being mostly Germanic peoples. The truth is, some of them were not Germanic. Some of those migrants or invaders were Iranic, and they included the Sarmatians. The fact, which is uncontested and uncontroversial within academia among historians, anthropologists, nevertheless hidden by using their specific tribal names and omitting their broader Iranic identity. When you say the Roxolans or the Alans, people don't realize those are Iranic peoples. And a lot of people like me from my ethnicity think that that's by design. Whereas with the Goths or the Ostrogoths, they do use the specific names, but they also say these are broadly Germanic peoples. When it comes to the Sarmatians and the Alans, they never say these are broadly Iranic peoples.
No, that's for sure. My first introduction to the Alans, to be frank, was that I thought they were basically like, tall, blonde hair, blue eye Russians or, Finnish peoples. Well, let
me complicate the situation. So if we're not talking about what do they look like phenotypically, they were very close to the Germans. So these are not the Persians who are darker, because they've been mixing with Mesopotamians for 3,000 years. So I myself, I'm a Persian. I'm darker skinned. So I don't really look like these people. These people actually are North Iranians. Let me give you an example that'll make sense. In the Iranic world, just like in the European world to the west, generally the further north you go, the lighter skinned people are. And this might have to do with climate, obviously, over the years. Sure. So just like in the European world, a Swede and a Southern Italian don't look exactly the same. There's shades of difference between skin color and eye color and hair color on the whole. Same thing in the Iranian world. If in the South Iranian world, the Persians and the Medes that we know of from Greek history and the Bible and so on and so forth, in Mesopotamia and in Iran, are darker skinned, both for climatic reasons and also because they have been living with much older and more civilized Mesopotamian peoples for thousands of years. The ones to the north of them, or what is now Eurasia, Russia, from what we can tell from the mummies we found phenotypically, are almost indistinguishable from their German cousins. So these are, and again, they're not all blonde, of course. Even today, when we go to Sweden, I think the majority are still not blonde. That's kind of the extreme example I'm using on the northwest corner of the world.
Well, the world's most famous Aryan wasn't even close to blonde, or tall, or blue-eyed.
Well, if we're talking about that guy, yeah.
Yeah.
So phenotypically, they're Europoid, but there's also great variation. So a Scythian from further east may even have Turkic Mongol features.
Sure.
And a Scythian so we got to remember that these are very loosely defined linguistic groups. These are pastoral people. These are an equestrian, horse-obsessed people that are constantly on the move, and they're tribes that are melting in and out of each other with the names changing, every century or two. So an Alan and a Roxalan may mean something to a historian today in terms of distinguishing them from each other, those two terms. But for themselves, they may have actually been one people.
Right?
So we just have to realize it's sort of like the North American Indians in the sense that they're very highly mobile, right? Except they have horses, so they're even more mobile. And it's not a race the way we would define it today. It's a linguistic group. It's a clan. It's a tribe, and they're constantly forming alliances with each other, and they're falling in and out of alliances with each other. One day they may be best of friends, and tomorrow they may be fighting.
Everything is professional wrestling, with procreation.
Yeah, that's a good example. So
it's people salad, just like most every place else. It's people salad, but over a long span of time for all of the reasons that one might think in Game of Thrones or anything else.
That's right. So, I believe that the oversight in not mentioning the word ironic, at least not in the title of anything, is not an accident. I think there's a lot of us believe that it's a little bit of has to do with current politics, since Iran is not the favorite country of the West these days. That applies to even trying to erase it from history.
And we can even take that a step further. We won't here, but I think that anybody who is an intelligent listener can probably figure out the next step dealing with current protectionism and xenophobia as to why it may be convenient to forget the actual origin.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll say a couple words about that too, because there's been a lot, this can't be proven, but there's been a lot written about this. What I'm saying is not new. It may be new to your listeners, but for people from India, from Iran, and that part of the world, this is almost like accepted dogma. But this is all the British. The British are behind all this. They're trying to erase us from history, so on and so forth. There's actually a little bit of truth to that. You see, what happened is that when the British colonized India, India had for the previous several hundred years been a Persianate culture. It was ruled by linguistically and culturally, although not ethnically, Persian dynasty, the Mughals. And it had a largely Persianate literature and high culture. And the British were a little bit concerned about that, and they really went out of their way in the 19th century to erase anything Persian or Iranian, because they wanted to be the top dog now. They wanted to be the new colonizer, and they didn't want any memory of the previous colonizer.
Right.
And that makes some sense. Whereas if you look at historiography of Europe prior to the British invasion of India, Persia or Iran was actually always looked at with great esteem, and there wasn't anything negative. It's only in the last 200 years that in the Anglosphere, this sort of demonization on the one hand, or just completely ignoring of and diminishing of anything Persian has occurred. Not so much in Germany, not so much in France, mostly in the Anglosphere, the English-speaking world.
It's a little side note is that, ever since Rome fell, sort of fell, completely fell, everybody sort of wants to be the new Rome, except none of them actually learned one of the lessons of Rome, which Rome sort of borrowed from the Greeks before them, was that you don't crush everyone and erase them. You sort of let them have their way and just slowly insinuate your names onto it. So it's basically the same stuff, but it's assimilation. Everyone sort of feels, eventually gets a pride. I mean, people wanted to be Roman citizens. I don't think that any, very few people that were subjugated to the British colonies wanted to be British citizens, unless it was for strictly economic reasons. But, that's why the Roman Empire is, sort of lasted longer. I mean, there's other reasons too. I don't want to oversimplify it, but
appropriation. Yeah. You have to make people feel a part of. Yeah. So the argument of this upcoming book and documentary project, which is an argument well known to thousands of scholars, historians, linguists, or anthropologists, and much of what we think of as medieval, feudal European culture is in fact at least partially Iranic. And that may sound like, you say that to someone who's not well versed in this stuff, and they think you're talking about how the moon is made from cheese, like you're some crazy lunatic standing on the street corner. But in fact, again, if anyone looks this stuff up, it's not controversial within the field of specialists, within academia. It just somehow doesn't percolate to the History Channel shows and to the Discovery Channel shows and these sorts of mass media popularizers of history. So it hasn't so far. So I hope to change that in the near future. We'll see.
I hope so too. If I may, just a couple of sort of not analogies, but similar circumstances that people accept without question, and it's thematically it's sort of similar. But the word Cossack comes from Kazakhstan. Everyone thinks Cossacks were the guys with the big fez hats and the curvy swords and very, very European. Well, but you think of Kazakh, you think of Kazakhstan. You don't think of that at all. The word assassin probably came from Hashashim, which was Iranic, Arabian, in that part of the world, which is assassin could be anyone, but when we think of assassin, we think of James Bond or Gal Gadot or whatever.
No, they were actually Muslim fundamentalists. well, we'll get into it, but perhaps a little more esoteric than the fundamentalists. But it was definitely a cult. I'll give you another couple of examples since you brought up how words take on different connotations. The word Slav originally was slave.
Yep.
The word Berber, which are North African people, and barbar or barbarian are related.
Mm-hmm.
Not exactly, flattering.
Right. And technically, I was corrected that barbar actually means not Greek, which was the same thing as basically barbarian.
That's right.
And chemistry is from Al-Kamir.
Yeah, well, whether it had a negative connotation or not is controversial. Some have, made the point that you make that it simply it's not a value judgment. It simply means we don't understand it. Others say no, it means both things. They were kind of making fun of it too. Like these people sound like we all do. If something sounds different than us, then it almost automatically think of our junior high or middle school years.
Right. Well, the point is. This point is that there's words that folks use in their everyday language right now that came from something that they probably wouldn't associate with it, and it's just the thought. It's just the same thought jump. It's the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's correct. And so the argument of my upcoming project will be that the influence, this influence of these Iranic peoples includes not only material culture, such as we'll get into it, but chainmail, armor, equestrian, knightly lifestyle, but also significant elements of a lot of medieval romances and legends and literature and folk tales, including the biggest one, of course, being the Arthurian cycle, as well as romances like Tristan and Isolde, which most people, when they think of Europe, there's nothing more European than that. And my argument will be that actually comes from the Parthian story. Older than that, it was brought there by the Alans.
So, folks, if you haven't figured it out now, we are now transitioning from pure history and conversation to pure history and sort of the fun stuff I was alluding to, your King Arthur and whatnot.
Yeah.
So, if they haven't figured it out on their own, I've now made it clear. But please continue.
Absolutely. So, pass this by. Some water. So the homeland of this subgroup of northern Iranic peoples is the Pontic steppe that I mentioned before. People don't know where that is. It's Ukraine. It's today's Ukraine and Russia, north of the Black Sea, between the Black Sea, and a little bit further west to the Caspian.
So also Georgia, Belarusish, or sort of that whole area.
That's right. Yeah, that's the Caucasus. So depending, because again, these are pastoral people, so they certainly didn't live within fixed boundaries. But that general area, including the Caucasus, between the Black, if somebody pulls out a map or a globe, they'll see for themselves, basically between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea, or to the north of that.
Yeah, there were a bunch of sort of famous kings in the past named Pontus, and I believe that they were kings of what's now Philpot, which was also where the Golden Fleece was. I might, or sort of around that.
Look, you're talking about something slightly different but related.
Okay.
I think. Look, in Iranian history, there was such a thing called the Parthian Empire, the Parthian dynasty, which fought. I think that's what you're talking about. So let me say a couple words about that since you brought it up. So this was the dynasty or the Iranian Empire that fought the early Romans, the early Roman Republic and the early Roman Empire. And in fact, that dynasty of Iran, that ruling class of Iran, were North Iranians, very, very similar ethnically, culturally to these Alans and Sarmatians who migrated later into Europe. So, in fact, so during that time, you could say all the way from Iran itself through Western Europe, it was one Iranic culture complex to the north of the Mediterranean, right? To the south, it's still Rome and Byzantium later. So let me just move here.
You need a minute to clear your throat?
The distance of the... Sorry, go ahead.
Do you need a minute to clear your throat, or are you okay?
No, I just had to get some water.
Okay.
So very few individuals, again, think of these these northern barbarian invasions as anything other than Germans. In fact, sometimes they've been called Eastern Germans or Ostrogoths. But in fact, today we know that there were many of them, although there were Ostrogoths and Eastern Germans as a part of that, there were also many Sarmatians. So we talked about what they look like. The Bosporan Kingdom that you mentioned is essentially a hybrid Greco-Iranian kingdom, you could say, if you know the story of the Poison King and Mithridates. Mm-hmm. Mithridates is an Iranian term. That's actually the Greek version of it. The Iranian term is Mehrdad, is the real name. Has to do with Mithra, the god Mithra. God-given is what it really means. Oh. So they created a hybrid kingdom that was partially Iranic and partially Greek. In fact, Mithridates the Great, or the sixth, the Mithridates Pontus, the Poison King, famously traced his ancestors both to Darius the Great and Cyrus the Great on the one hand, and Alexander the Great on the other. And believe it or not, he fought. A lot of people today think of Greco-Roman civilization on one hand, and then Iranian Persian civilization as the enemy in the east. But in fact, during this era, he fought on behalf of what he considered Greco-Iranian civilization against an upstart Rome.
Right.
So it's amazing how our understanding of alliances is not necessarily correct, at least not throughout all of history. There was a good several centuries from the time of Alexander to the rise of the Sasanians in Persia, where you could say that the Greeks and the Persians had become one unified culture. And in fact, Nietzsche famously says that he would have much preferred if the Persians had successfully and permanently conquered Greece, as opposed to the Romans of all people, he says, and I'm paraphrasing it.
Sure. Folks, I want you to take a footnote into Mithridates or Pontus, the Poison King. I don't think we're going to talk about it here, but look it up yourself. It's a ironic story, and honestly, you could probably find something on it that'll take less than 5 minutes. But it'll be worth your time.
I recommend it as well. Yeah, because that's a whole other story, and there's actually been a few documentaries on it. You can probably look it up on YouTube as well. So, did I cut you off?
No. I cut you off actually with the little footnote, but I didn't want to go into that side story because it is its own thing.
Absolutely. So, let's now talk about some of these groups, Iranic groups, and where they went in Europe and what happened to them. So, first of all, the nearest part of Europe, the near west, right, to the Iranians is the Balkans. Right? So, let's talk about the Serbs and Croatians and Bulgarians. The presence of Iranic populations in these populations has been well documented now for a long time. There's little doubt that these, what were former Yugoslav populations, have some degree of Iranic or Aryan admixture, in addition to the Slavic, which is, everyone knows about that. From about 1,000 years ago, that region was inhabited by Iranic Sarmatians specifically from their north and their west, north of the Black Sea there. Interestingly, in fact, just recently I read an article that really surprised me. A group of Bulgarian researchers, they concluded an extensive sort of fact-finding anthropological trip to Iran, and they came back with a unanimous conclusion that Bulgarians have Iranian ancestry. This was it was based on genetic, historical, linguistic, anthropologic, folkloric, even some art history, and the great paper I think that they wrote is called the I wrote this note down for myself. It's called The Common Origin of Croats, Serbs, and Jats by Dr. Samar Abbas. And that was the conclusion. Then there's another group. So the Serbs and the Croats and the Balkans, that's pretty well known and fairly uncontroversial. There's a group of these Iranics called the Aorsi, A-O-R-S-I. They're known to the Greek sources as Aorsoi. I'm not sure exactly how they would have pronounced it. They're an ancient Iranian people, subcategory of the Sarmatians. They played a major role in events from 1st century BC, 1st century AD. And the word Aorsi is generally linked to the Avestan. Avestan is an ancient Iranian language, the language in which the hymns of Zarathustra and the holy books of Zoroastrianism were written, by the way.
Oh, cool.
It's generally linked to the Avestan Aorusa and the Ossetic Urs or Ors, meaning light or shining or brilliant.
What was the root word? I'm sorry for that.
So the root of that is an Avestan term called Aorusa.
Rusa.
A-U-R-S-A, yeah. And that's where, all these terms get corrupted from one language to another. And corrupted, by the way, is a linguistic term. It doesn't have a negative connotation. It simply means changed.
Right.
Then there is the Jazz. Again, it's spelled J-A-S-Z. I'm not sure if you put the emphasis on the Z or the S. Who went further into Central Europe to Hungary. And were still a documented distinct population in regions of Hungary till the 19th century. In fact, even today, many Hungarian place names still are named after them. And if people want to look into the Jazz, which comes from, in Persian, it's Yaz with a Y, but the J is silent. Then there's the much larger group called the Alans, or Alans, who went much, much further and had a longer lasting, I would say, influence in Europe. The name Alania stems from the Old Iranian root Aryana, so Alan and Aran, the L and R are interchangeable.
Okay.
Again, a derivative of the Indo-Iranian root Arya, or Aryan. And again, it's cognate with this name of Iran, Aran or Iran. So Alan and Iran are again cognates of the same word again, Aryan. Stems from the Old Persian Aryanum. And these people originally had a kingdom for themselves in what is now somewhere around, you mentioned the area, Dagestan, Chechnya, parts of Russia and the Black Sea. There was such a thing as the medieval Alanic kingdom. In fact, just recently I posted a picture on the Facebook group of one of the oldest churches in Russia. And it's an Alanic church. And that kingdom was attacked in the 12th century, 12th, 13th centuries by Timurid and Mongol Turkic peoples from the east. But that church still survives, and it's a beautiful church. And to this day, it's known as the Alanic Church, one of the oldest churches in what is now Russia. So these Alans were pushed, you could say, from the east by a further Turco-Mongol wave of invaders, migrants, you could call them, and were pushed further and further west, first into Eastern Europe and Central Europe, and eventually they got as far as Gaul or France.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, in France, certain cities like Alincourt or Allenville, carrying their name. And some of them went across the Pyrenees into northern Spain, or what is now Catalonia, which, in fact, even the word Catalonia is a derivative of Goth, Alania. Remember I was mentioning that along with those German invaders of the Roman Empire, were these Iranic invaders. Well, they rode together, and they rode. When they got to Spain, they were basically one group, and so Goth Alania is an alliance of these Germanic Goths and these Iranic Alans or Alans. In Hungary, there's even a region inhabited by descendants of the Alans known as Jászberényi. I'm sure I'm mispronouncing it. Again, in Hungary, the Alans were called the Yaz or the Jaz. And it still celebrates, Hungary still celebrates some of their traditions, such as the ceremonial, something called the blowing of the 9th century horn. So even to this day, there's, Hungarian festivals or, traditions that go back to these Alanic peoples.
Well, was Attila? Probably the most famous Hun was Attila Iranic?
Oh, no, not at all. Attila and the Huns are Mongoloid Turkic peoples. Those are the peoples from basically what is now Mongolia who pushed the Alans west from their east, right? That's an entirely different group. Although, again, things are complicated because there were times where some of the Alans who are Iranic and the Huns who are Turkic and Mongol did actually ally with each other, oftentimes. So it's complicated, but they're vastly different groups.
Right.
In fact, it's that Mongol-Turkic push from their east that pushed these Iranic Alans further west.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
There's always people salad, but Attila the Hun, different group.
Different group, entirely different group, culturally, linguistically, different group.
Perfect.
Now, there's another group, again, all of these sort of subcategories of the Sarmatians, right, called the Iazigis. That's Iazyges. And they appear to have ruled over some Germanic, Celtic, and Dacian populations to the north of what is now modern Budapest. And many of these Iazigi knights, it was many of these Iazigi knights who were transported, and we know this from history, it's actually part of Roman written history, transported to Britain by the Roman legions. The Romans fought these people constantly on the border of their empires, and when they would defeat them, they found that they're very good warriors. They're solid warriors. They have chainmail armor. They're highly skilled. They're brave, and so they would use them. And they very famously, the Romans transport about 18,000 Iazigi Iranic knights to Britain, Roman Britain, what is now northern England, to man Hadrian's Wall, which is, about Hadrian's Wall.
Sure.
Yeah, to keep out the British people to the north of that. And those Iazigi Iranic knights settled in Britain. And you might think, well, 18,000 isn't a very large population. That's true. But actually, if you consider the population of that region at that time, we're talking about 2nd, 3rd century here, it was a significant portion of the population.
Well, 1,000 soldiers was a huge army in what we call Britain now in that time. If you had 60 guys, you could run roughshod over large parts of a country.
These were armored knights. And keep in mind, again, the contention here is, and what people need to sort of realize, whether they have heard it before or whether it sounds strange to them or not, that was not normal in northern Britain. This is something that these Iranic peoples brought with them. In fact, even the way of dress, and we'll get to that later, was influenced. Prior to that, they looked very much, they dressed in togas and so on and so forth, at least in the Roman regions. But what we call the medieval European look was largely influenced by these Alanic, Yazigi, Sarmatian, Iranic peoples. In fact, I'll mention recently there have been now we have genetics. So we no longer have to rely simply on finding an arrow here, an artifact there, or a linguistic similarity or a bit of tantalizing, reference in some sort of literary text. We now have genetics. And recent genetic tests have shown that certain townships in northern England clearly have Iranic genes and haplogroups, and clearly identifiable to this day. Now that we know, who these people were, what they were called, and where they went, I want to also say a couple of words about, what they contributed. In the Slavic world, in Russia, of course, the state of Iranic studies is quite advanced, much more so than here. If you go to Russia and the Soviet Union before that, there are libraries of archaeology and investigations done, and that makes total sense because the Russians clearly see themselves as descendants, very literally, of these peoples from the earliest times. They realize not just genetically but culturally that this Iranian component is a major part, along with the Slavic part, the Tartars, the Vikings, so on, that were added to this layer cake a little bit later.
Sure.
In fact, I saw something in the news recently. It's not necessarily good news, but the new Russian nuclear missile is called the Sarmat, and they named it after the Sarmatians.
Swell. We didn't do it.
Exactly, yeah. So again, if you go to the Russian sphere of the world, and formerly the Soviet, this stuff is quite well known, much more so than it is in the West. Now, as far as the material culture, chainmail armor was something that these Sarmatians brought to Europe with them. Europeans already, the Romans certainly had armor, the Persians to the south had armor, but it was mostly a different type of armor. It wasn't as fluid or easy to move in as chainmail.
Right.
It was mostly scale armor. Chainmail gave you a level of mobility that allowed these people to basically live in their armor on their horses, whereas the Romans and the southern Iranian Persians, they would have scale armor, which is very, very heavy. And once you put it on, imagine the medieval knight. You could go for one run and then you were done.
Right.
People had to help you to take those things off. Another bit of material culture that is Iranic in origin that also made its way to Europe through these people is trousers, pants. The Scythian Iranians and Sarmatians are known, as far as we know so far, to be probably the oldest people who wore pants regularly. Baggy trousers, the kind that Kurdish people wear even today, or Afghan Tajiks and Tajiks wear even today. You've seen the baggy trousers. Pretty much the same thing. And the reason for that is they lived on their horses. Whereas most of the rest of the world, the Romans and even the Indians, so on and so forth, were some variation of the toga. The name Alan, the boy's name, or in French, Alain, comes from the Hellenic peoples. Griffins, if you go to cathedrals in Europe, you often see these gargoyle type things.
Right. Yeah, the eagle head, the lion body.
Yeah, it's a hybrid creature. We think mythological. Who knows? Maybe it existed.
Right. You never know.
Exactly. Sure. I hope it existed.
This is Garden of Doom. We accept that they exist. Yes.
So the griffins are a motif that was brought in by these Sarmatians. Another big one is dragons. Now, dragon was actually the emblem of these Sarmatians and the Scythians. Well, for a couple of reasons, historians think. One, because the chainmail that they wore and oftentimes draped in green cloth made them look, when they're attacking you, like a giant lizardy thing. The other one was that they actually had a banner. I forget what this type of banner or flag is actually called. It has a name. But something like a wind chime almost, a flag that you carry with you that the wind blows up as you are riding. And it was a dragon banner. And so the Scythians are now thought by many historians to have carried this dragon insignia, this motif, as far west as Europe, and also as far east as China. There's arguments that the dragon, which is so common in Chinese art and mythology, also was introduced to them in the east by these same Scythians, as people got around.
It's interesting.
We know. Yeah, go ahead. You were going to say something?
I mean, it's interesting because the myth of Saint George who slayed the dragon was about a metaphor for Christians slaying something non-Christian, which
That's exactly right. In fact, I'm glad you brought that up because there's some arguments. Again, this is sort of conjecture here, and it has to be because there's no way to prove this, right? But there's arguments among historians that they were talking about the Scythians. The dragon represented these invading Scythians. In fact, I'll tell you, in the southern Iranian Persian culture, in the Shahnameh, which is sort of our Odyssey and Iliad combined, there's lots of references to Rustam fighting the dragon. Right. And the dragon, a lot of people who have studied the Shahnameh in depth, they believe it's also a reference to these same northern Iranic barbarians.
And as I think back, I'm certainly no an expert on these things, but I did a show on dragons and we did some research on that. And, in doing the show, you become exposed to a lot of things. And serpents were used a lot, flying serpents, Hydra, Leviathan, which has been, interpreted to be a sea dragon-like. But the word dragon didn't really exist. You might have had the Midgard serpent or, different versions of serpent or some sort of creature that could be considered like a dragon, but the term dragon did come later.
Yeah. In fact, if you look at, there are early medieval European manuscripts and illustrations within those manuscripts that depict these Sarmatians, and they depict them sometimes carrying that dragon banner. Again, I can't think of the name for that type of a flag, but it's almost, think of a kite.
I was thinking of a kite. I was actually thinking of like those at the airport, those sort of wind-catching orange.
That's exactly what I'm talking about. That's right. You know the ones you see at car dealerships?
Yep. a little less scary there.
A little less scary, yeah. Yeah, so there's actual medieval European manuscripts that depict these people carrying that dragon banner.
That's really cool. Well, there's also the most famous House of Dracul, which it was in the Carpathians, which is very much within this region where Iranic peoples settled and may in fact rule, and that's our friend Vlad Teshpesh or whatever his last name was.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a friend named Drago, and I always tease him, that's a Sarmatian Iranic term. Yeah. Absolutely. Then there's some influence on architecture. So we think of Gothic architecture as sort of being purely European, but in fact it's a combination of Romanesque, Sasanian, Persian architecture, and and of course they added quite a lot to it. Just because there's influence doesn't mean that it's taken whole cloth.
Right.
Influence is important, but of course each culture adds to it and makes it their own, as we saw in the flowering of Gothic architecture from the 11th, 12th centuries onward in Europe. So some of the elements of Gothic architecture that are theorized by a lot of art historians, particularly Arthur Upham Pope and Roman Gershman, who argued that the apse, I don't know if everyone is familiar with that term, it's an architectural term, it's a semicircular recess covered with a hemispherical vault or dome within a cathedral. The apse, the wood vaulting that you see in Gothic architecture, the pointed arch, and even the flying buttress, which is so typically associated with the high Gothic architecture of Europe. All of these have precedence in Sasanian Persian architecture, and the argument of people like Pope and Roman Gershman, is that a lot of these elements, how do they make it to Europe from Sasanian Iran? Not through Rome per se, some of it did, but that was more of a barrier than a conduit, but through these North Iranians, who, after all, shared exactly the same culture complex as the Parthians who ruled Iran at the same time.
So tell me about King Arthur. Give me the King Arthur. I want fun.
So that's the next thing. Is the big thing culturally, other than material culture and architecture, is King Arthur. There was a lot of historians over the years have made the connection to some of these Sarmatian stories, but the two authors that pulled it together were Littleton and Malchor, with a extraordinary book, a seminal work in the field. Still the minority opinion, but nevertheless, it's so scholarly that it now really had to be taken seriously. Argue that much of the Arthurian cycle of stories of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table, Lancelot and Guinevere, many of those stories are actually stories of folklore brought by the Sarmatian Yazigi Iranic Knights to Britain, to France, which mixed with pre-existing Celtic lore. So, for example, some of the stories like Lady in the Lake, that doesn't seem to have any Iranic precedent. It seems to be purely Celtic. On the other hand, stories like elements like the sword and the stone are absolutely Iranic. In fact, a discovery was made that kind of revolutionized the field of the Nart sagas. If we geographically go back now to the Caucasus, where these people kind of originated, they have these are North Iranic peoples and Caucasian people. Caucasian meaning from the Caucasus, right? Not broadly speaking. That's another one of those words that has multiple meanings.
It sure does.
Right. These people have a series of folk tales that were finally written down in the 19th century, but had been oral tradition for many, many centuries and perhaps millennia, called the Nart sagas. And when this was discovered and written, people were just flabbergasted how similar it was to many of the elements of the Arthurian cycle. And now the more Iranic peoples went to Britain, had a kingdom in Gaul and Spain and all over Europe, it makes total sense that they would have brought some of this folklore with them.
Of course.
That mixed again, it's not all of it. And so the theory, and I'm very quickly, I mentioned it briefly in a previous conversation too, if people are interested in really delving into it, I would highly recommend buying a book called From Scythia to Camelot by Littleton and Malchor, the late great scholar Littleton and Dr. Malchor as well. And their argument is not that King Arthur was Iranic or Iranian or Sarmatian. Their argument is King Arthur was actually a Roman, but his to the extent that there is a historic figure that these myths were wrapped around, this folklore was wrapped around, that the knights were Sarmatians. And in fact, Dr. Malchor added a very crucial piece to this argument, that even the word Lancelot is from Alan of Lot, Lot being a region in France. And again, it's a extraordinarily scholarly and well-wrought sort of argument. And again, anyone who's interested in following up on that, From Scythia to Camelot by Littleton and Malchor. There was even a movie recently, every few years there's a King Arthur movie somewhere.
Sure.
Either for TV or theatrical.
Public domain.
And in one of the most recent movies, they actually use this theory. They use the Sarmatian theory, it's called. But again, my pet peeve is they never use the word Iranic. They're burying it with words like who the hell knows what a Sarmatian is, right?
Right. Yeah. It's safer. It's more marketable, I suppose.
Safer, yeah.
Which movie? What's the movie called?
If it was a Germanic subgroup, they would say it's a Germanic group. But when it comes to an Iranic group, they leave that out. But if people go and look up Sarmatian, they will see that it's an Iranic group.
Right.
I'm not sure too many people will go from the theater to Wikipedia. But
what was the movie called?
Go ahead.
What was the movie called?
I forget what it's called. It came out in 2004 or 5. I can link it to you afterward. It's one of the big Arthurian movies, the second to the last that came out. But very famously, the beginning of the film, sometimes there's a credit that gives you a little explanation of just the setting and such, and they absolutely use the Sarmatian theory.
Was it the one with Clive Owen?
They never explained who the Sarmatians are. What's that?
Was it the one with Clive Owen as the star?
What year did that come out?
Probably around there, around the early aughts.
Early aughts, that's what it was. Yeah. I'll text it to you after after the fact.
Okay.
So that's the huge one, because what is more identified with British culture and French culture and medieval European culture than the Arthurian stories. And you can imagine the ruckus is caused to say that at least a chunk of it, at least a significant portion of these stories were from these Ironic peoples.
And it really shouldn't, it really shouldn't. I mean, I know why it does, but I mean, right now, the legends as we know it have so much. You have Morgana Le Fay and Lancelot, which are clearly, French names, in Britain. And of course, France and Britain share so much of their history that nobody thinks twice about it. But, some of these characters were brought in later, depending on who you believe on the origin. So, the fact that there are other influences or other origins should not surprise us all.
And keep in mind the time frame we're talking about here, Jeff. We're talking about these people, these Ironic peoples were in Britain and in France, and they settled, and they're still there. They just mixed with the local population. They're baked in, you could say. From around 200 BC onward. So they were there long before the time that the Arthurian cycle was organized in any meaningful way.
Right.
Into what we call the Arthurian cycle, and certainly long before the Middle Ages. And so there was plenty of time for these stories to percolate and mix with each other. And again, I'm just giving you the general gist of it, but it's extraordinarily well argued, point by point, region by region, name by name, writer by writer, in this great book that I can't recommend enough. I'll say it the third time, From Scythia to Camelot. And then there's another one, Jeff, another stepping outside the Arthurian stories and folk tales. There's also Tristan and Isolde, which is a famous medieval European romance.
Sure.
And now, and actually it's not new, people have been arguing for quite a long time that it is likely, at least partially influenced by an earlier Parthian Iranian story called Vis and Ramin, which has had also many incarnations in the Iranic world. It was originally a sort of a folk tale, and then it was used by the famous writer Nizami, and so on and so forth. It's had many incarnations. And the epic of Vis and Ramin was written in verse in the 11th century. But the narrative is believed to date from the Parthian era, so from around 200 BC to 280.
Wow.
Much older than that. The story, it's of two, star-crossed lovers. Has echoes in Celtic story of Tristan and Isolde, of course. And both stories, they feature a young woman, Vis, or Isolde in the European version, married to an older king, Mobad in the Iranian version, Mark in the European version. They have an affair between the queen and a young relative of the queen, or of the king, I should say, Ramin, or Tristan in the European version. And some of the similarities throughout the story include Ramin and Tristan falling in love with their paramours while bringing them to the men that they're supposed to marry. A handmaiden or nurse with magical knowledge who takes the place of her mistress in her husband's bed. And then they both have an ordeal by fire. And they both have a separation between the two lovers, where the young man goes off and marries someone else for a while before returning. So, every bit of the story is pretty much the same. And so the question was always, how is it that this, clearly we know this was a Parthian story and it's earlier than Tristan, you could have made it to Europe. And of course, the vector that's theorized is through the Alans, because the Alans were the same culture complex as the Parthians. And certainly they would have shared a lot of the same folk tales.
No, straight line.
So that's that. And then, of course, if we have time, how are we on time?
We're doing fine on this end. We don't have time limits on the Garden of Doom, but we're just over an hour and 12 minutes.
A couple of more points on as far as the history of kind of Iranic identity within Europe.
Okay.
Although it's not very well known to the population now, to the general population, I should say, there were times where it was. believe it or not, there was a movement called Sarmatism in Poland, where the Polish nobility started to dress like Sarmatians. This is, like 16th, 17th century now, so it's much, much later, right? So it's a harking back to like a golden age, right? Mm-hmm. But they very much clearly identified themselves, the nobility, right, as opposed to the general population, which were Slavs. The nobility said, we are Aryans, we are Sarmatians. And there was a whole movement where they dressed differently, and there was a whole set of poetry and literature around it called Sarmatism. People can look it up. And that went out of style, after the 19th century. Then here's the sort of the clincher for me, is that not only is there genetic evidence, not only is there Roman history, not only are there artifacts, folkloric evidence, we actually have very specific Scottish and Irish written history that claims that they are from Scythian and Sarmatian origins. Did you know that?
I did not.
In the 1320s, I'll give you two examples. A letter was written, 1320, so we're talking about the high Middle Ages now. A letter was signed by nearly 50 Scottish earls and barons to the Pope. I don't know who the Pope was at that moment, asking him to recognize Scotland's independence and recognize Robert the Bruce as king.
Oh, okay.
In this letter, signed by nearly 50, Scottish nobles, in this document, there's a curious reference to Greater Scythia. The declaration states that the Scots' origins are from Greater Scythia, and that their ancestors sailed to Scotland by way of the let me see if I can say this correctly, Theronian Sea. Theronian Sea is an old term for a portion of the Mediterranean.
Gotcha.
And through the Pillars of Hercules, or Straits of Gibraltar, as we know them now, into the Atlantic, and then to Scotland. So in one of the oldest Scottish documents, they themselves are claiming they're from Scythian origin.
This is a reach, and the answer might well be no, but is Scotia come from Scythia?
I don't know. I've heard that. Others say no. I'm not a linguist, and so when I've said that on the site, people have attacked me and said that's so. I won't go that far.
Okay.
I don't know. I simply don't know.
It's rank speculation.
That's speculative. But here we have actual Scottish history saying, well, look, we're from. So they obviously had some knowledge from their past.
And everybody should know Robert the Bruce from Braveheart. So this was some years after Braveheart when Robert the Bruce, I guess, got his courage back.
That's right. There's an even older, so that was from 12th, 13th century. There's an even older reference, another origin story, that links the Picts,
Sure.
One of the groups that invaded Britain, to the Scythians as well. This time the source is the Venerable Bede, who was a monk. A lot of your listeners will have heard of the Venerable Bede. And he was an English monk at the monastery of St. Peter, and a companion monastery of St. Paul in the kingdom of Northumbria, of the Angles.
Sure.
And so this was 8th century, if I'm correct. And the story is that these Scythians came by ship to Ireland, but the Irish refused to let them land, but told them of another land, Scotland, namely. And the Picts, who claimed to be Scythians, and coming from the sea, they took some Irish women with them as sort of a compromise to invading Ireland itself, to settle Scotland, but under the condition that they would, from that point onward, promote the kingship or the royal line from the female or matrilineal side. And since they're taking these Irish women, well, the Irish would be now the royalty in Scotland.
Ah.
So
Everybody wins.
Gods do have a share, according even to the Venerable Bede, of the Scythian genetic inheritance, you could say.
I have to take a pause here for a second because I just realized I said everybody wins. We don't know if those women won. I mean, we don't know that for sure. We don't know if they volunteered or not.
Unfortunately, women have throughout history been used often like property, essentially.
Right. Let's hope they volunteered.
But there's a great book, another one I've mentioned, From Scythia to Camelot several times, but on this Irish topic in the Venerable Bede and so on and so forth. I would also recommend people to a more recent book called Erin and Iran, Erin, E-R-I-N, which is an old term for Ireland.
Sure.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And the subtitle is Cultural Encounters Between the Irish and the Iranians. It's by H.E. Chahabi and Grace Neville. It's a beautiful cover on it, and that also gets into this topic fairly deeply.
Excellent.
And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention, for those who again want to delve into this sort of thing, I'm sure a lot of your listeners will be familiar with Monty Python and the late great Terry Jones. He had a series. A lot of people don't know that he was actually a historian after the Python days, a legitimate historian. And he did a series called Barbarians, and one of the episodes is called The Brainy Barbarians, where he actually goes to Iran and he films a giant statue of a fully armored equestrian knight and horse. It's called the Tagh Bostan in Kermanshah province, Iran. And he's just flabbergasted because he says to his audience, is this 13th century Merovingian France?
Right.
No, it's Sasanian 5th century Iran. So he was also, he caught on to this connection on his own. And then, for people wondering, what happened to all these people? At what point did they become fully mixed in or baked into the larger European populations and no longer have a specific, let's say, Sarmatian identity or an Alanic identity? They just became Frenchmen or Brits. Well, that happened obviously over centuries, but if you go back to where they started, back to the Caucasus, back to the Pontic Steppe, over the Black Sea, there are actually still a people that still identify as distinct Alans. They are called the Ossetians. They call themselves the Irani, like Iranian.
Mm-hmm.
They speak a language very similar to Persian. They consider themselves part of the Iranian world. They are where they're situated. Ossetia is between Georgia, north of Georgia, and Russia. Part of it is in Russia, in the Russian Federation, and part of it is an independent state carved out of Georgia. The Ossetians are today's modern, still distinct descendants of the Alans, the ones who never went westward. And to this day, they consider themselves Iranic and Alanic. In fact, I will be doing an interview in the coming weeks with a preeminent Western Canadian Iranologist by the name of Richard Foltz. And he's just written a great book that just came out last year. He has a Ossetian wife himself, and he jokingly says that he's going to make Scythian babies.
Okay.
And he's written a book about these Ossets as the descendants, the modern day, still surviving, still distinct descendants of these Alanic peoples.
Well, that's great. This is terrific. But you know what? You promised me Amazons.
Oh yeah, sure. I almost forgot. You forgot about the Amazon.
No, don't forget the Amazons.
So again, the take that I have from everything I read is the Amazons were also mostly Iranic peoples, Sarmatians specifically. The Amazons were, remember, around 500 BC, 600 BC, 400 BC, during the golden age of Greece, Periclean Greece, that era, the Greeks were constantly not only fighting the southern Iranian Persians to their east, who invaded them a couple of times, but they were also fighting these sort of nomadic barbarian Iranic peoples to the north, the Sarmatians. and sometimes allied with them, sometimes fighting, and sometimes, they traded with them, Scythians and Sarmatians. And they were just flabbergasted and shocked that these Sarmatian peoples, they had female warriors, whereas in the Greek world, women certainly did not fight, and they were very much sort of second-class citizens. Greece has brought us many things, democracy and so on and so forth, and philosophy, but it was not one of the leaders in terms of women's rights.
Right.
Whereas these nomadic, barbarian, equestrian or onyx Sarmatians to the north were actually much more advanced on that front, at least. And even the story of the women, cutting off one of their breasts so they could shoot better with a bow and arrow, so on and so forth. Now, scholars believe that they were talking about mostly these Sarmatian female warriors. In fact, there's a reference, there's many references on this, but there was a good article in the BBC recently. If any of your listeners want to look it up online, it's called 2000-Year-Old Wonder Woman Who Inspired the Comic.
Right.
That title. I think it came out a year or two ago, so you can Google it. And I'll actually read you a couple of lines directly from the article,
sure,
if you don't mind.
No, go ahead.
And so, quote, "The Sarmatians were a people of Iranian heritage, with men and women skilled in horsemanship and battle. Excavations within the modern borders of Iran have revealed the existence of female warriors. In the northwestern Iranian city of Tabriz, 109 warrior graves were unearthed. Archaeologists found the DNA found in one of them belonged to a woman. DNA testing was due to take place on another warrior. On more warrior graves, 38 of which are still intact, but according to Mayer's contacts in Iran, that DNA research is halted because they ran out of funding in 2020, lack of resources. So contemporary audiences may recognize the character of Wonder Woman played by Gal Gadot. When I was a kid, it was Linda Carter.
Sure, Linda Carter. First was Kathy Lee Crosby. So.
Oh, okay, that's your time. Kathy Lee Crosby, okay.
Yes.
Yeah, I remember watching it Saturday mornings. I almost said Linda Blair. I think that was the Exorcist woman.
That was the Exorcist, yeah. Yeah. But yeah, Linda Carter is my Wonder Woman too.
Yeah, that's Gal Gadot. And the original comic book characters first appeared in the U.S. in 1941. More than the stories that inspired the character. The Amazons in Greek mythology basically are real-life warrior women that led to this iconic modern-day Wonder Woman character, who everyone now knows. In fact, they have roots in ancient Persia, modern-day Iran. And this is, again, a quote from the article itself. Now, the article, I think, is actually a little bit wrong, in my opinion, because, again, it's conflating Persia with Iranic, right? Mm-hmm. I think they have more clear roots in the northern Iranic heritage rather than the Persians, per se. But who's counting? In fact, I'll end it with this. If you look at today's Kurdish women, a lot of people are familiar through the news of the Kurdish women who were fighting ISIS a few years back, fairly successfully. These are Iranic peoples, of course. The Kurds are descendants of the Medes, one of the great Western Iranian peoples, historically and contemporary as well. And they have preserved that tradition. They are extremely independent, unlike what you would expect from the stereotype of a Middle Eastern woman. They're fairly rural to this day. And there's a little article that was written by a scholar in Canada named Kaveh Farouk, who's an Iranian-Canadian scholar. And if you don't mind, I'll read a couple of sentences from that as well.
I do not mind.
He talks about these women and why, he's surprised, as I'm no longer surprised, but he seems surprised or disheartened that they don't get the attention that they deserve in the West. So he says, perhaps more remarkable is the relative silence in academia, notably Iranian studies, to the role of ancient Iranian women that ancient Iranian women played in the military, as well as during the pre-Islamic and post-Islamic era. One exception is the late scholar Shapur Shahbazi's article on the Amazons in Encyclopedia Iranica, which is published by Columbia University, by the way. However, the general lack of academic rigor in this field is notable. Western academia, entertainment outlets, and news media have provided virtually no insight or reference to this topic. However, this may be explained in part due to the classicism as well as geopolitical considerations. Put simply, it is a fact that women warriors of ancient Persia have received the least amount of attention by Western scholarship and popular media. Nevertheless, regardless of whether Western academia, media, or political outlets choose, by choice or ignorance, to disregard the role of women in ancient Iran, that cultural legacy has remained remarkably resilient. And one example of this is in the April of 2016 report entitled Iranian Tribal Women. There's a great article about how there's an annual sort of an Olympiad of Iranic tribal women, equestrian women, who use bow and arrows on horseback, very much in the same tradition as their ancestors did thousands of years ago. Of course, now it's not actual war; it's a sport. So that tradition is actually going on in Iran as we speak today, even though it's the so-called Islamic Republic. And it's very interesting to me that they haven't been able to stop it. Probably because these are rural people and they kind of don't mess with them too much. But it's astonishing that after 2,500 years, that at least in the Kurdish part of the Iranian world, women are still riding horses, shooting bows and arrows, or shooting rifles now on horseback, from horseback, exactly in the same way as their so-called Amazon ancestor did, the Sarmatians, back in 25 or 500 BC.
Well, Linda Carter will always be my Wonder Woman. I'm a fan of Gal Gadot, and I guess they got it a little bit closer, probably by accident, because she's Israeli. So, I mean, that's good. That's getting close.
She is, isn't she? Yeah, that's right.
So that's good.
She's an extraordinarily beautiful woman as well. I don't want to be sexist about this one.
It's all right. I mean, I think everyone knows that she was hired partly because she's an extraordinarily beautiful woman. I mean, and in fact, she is.
So people, men and women are hired in Hollywood, not exactly for just their acting skills. Let's put it that way.
Correct. I mean, it is show business after all. That's why I do a podcast. So,
there you go.
Well,
that's why I only have the sound on here. So
there you go. Well, this is our own Darius the Great, or Darius the Great. Thank you for everything. Please tell the folks where they can find you, where they can support you, and all of the things that you're working on that they should look for at present and in the near term.
Sure. Again, my podcast, to which I will be adding episodes shortly, is simply called The Persian Version. They can simply Google it. It's on 12 or 13 different platforms. The Facebook group is Ariana, the history of the art and culture of the Iranic peoples. And again, I also want to mention that I am now starting a book/documentary project, hopefully both. Sometimes these things go together, about the migrations of the Iranic peoples into Europe, what we've kind of touched upon briefly in this, but hopefully I'll be interviewing a good number of scholars, both here in Canada and in Europe. And if I have the finances available, we'll be able to travel to meet these people and actually get some footage of some of these sites that we're talking about, from Russia all the way through Britain.
Excellent. All right. Well, very cool. Everybody look for that. And thank you once again, Darius. And folks, again, check out his podcast. Check out the prior Garden of Dune episode called The Persian Version. And we certainly hope to have Darius back again. We've been talking about some other topics. Actually, we had a much longer list for this one and whittled it down. So, and I brought up another one, which as well, which may or may not materialize. Anyway, if you like Darius, you can certainly hear him on his projects. And if you like to hear him in combination with me, you will almost certainly be doing so again, within the next few months. So I thank you so much again for being part of the show.
It's been fun as always, Jeff. Look forward to doing it again.
Great. All right, folks, we just disconnected with Darius. I hope I didn't cut him off while he was saying take care, but that's what he said. That was his closing line to me and to you as well. So check out his stuff, support his work. We'll be looking for his future projects. And like I said, we're definitely going to have him on the show again with some other fun and interesting topics. He says he's not an expert. I don't know. Sounds pretty expert to me, but what do I know? Anyway, again, part of the show is that you hear it, you digest it, you decide what you want to take from it, and if you want to do your own research, that's great. And there's, I would say that there's some pretty good companion shows here. The recent Red Line podcast had some stuff where there was some overlap. You may not see it initially, but when you listen to the whole show, I think you'll see that there's some overlap there. Also, the show with J.P. Bristow, the Russian Empire prequel, I think is what I called that episode. But that has explores some of the same concepts, but maybe more from the Turkic perspective a little bit. But there's certainly some overlap there, and there's some differences too, and you can judge those. Anyway, hope you had fun. Hope you found it interesting. It's cool to think that King Arthur and the Amazons and Tristan and Isolde, which I always said Isolde, but I'm sure I said it wrong, may, if not definitively, have some Iranic origins to them. So, yeah, I'm not going to say any more because I'll just be repeating myself, which is another trademark of the show. Anyway, thanks so much. We will see you next week again, or you'll hear us next week. I certainly hope you'll take the time to share with friends who might be interested in the wide panoply of topics that we cover on Garden of Doom. It's like 20 different podcasts rolled up into one. That's my sales pitch this week. But give us 5 stars, write a review. It certainly helps. Spotify and Apple both allow for that, so it really does help. Whatever those algorithms are that recommend shows to other people as well. And we really do benefit from word of mouth. So I'm excited about the prospects for the show going forward. Made some contacts recently and going to continue to do what we do, which is collaborate with a lot of other great, fun, interesting podcasts and interesting people. We're rolling ever closer to the Theorem Anthropology Conference, so we're going to start getting some of those folks on board. Already have a show or two recorded that'll be ready for that as well. So anyway, thanks for everything. See you next time.